Across the global ocean floor, long curved lines appear along the edges of several ocean basins. On large-scale seafloor maps, these lines mark the locations of ocean trenches. Viewed individually, a single trench may appear as a narrow arc in a distant part of the ocean. When their positions are placed together on global maps, a much larger geographic structure becomes visible. The distribution of these trenches extends across multiple ocean basins and connects regions separated by vast distances. Some trench corridors follow the outer margins of continents. Others align beside long chains of islands that arc across the Pacific Ocean. Several extend for thousands of kilometers along basin boundaries, while a smaller number appear in remote ocean sectors far from continental coastlines. In certain regions, trenches form dense regional clusters. In others, they appear as isolated segments, separated by wide areas of the seafloor. This video presents a slow overview of where ocean trenches appear across the world's oceans. Moving across different regions, it traces the major trench corridors, regional clusters, and high-latitude sectors where these deep seafloor features are mapped. And to begin, the first step is to look at the global reference map that shows where the major trench systems appear across the ocean basins. Ocean trenches form a distributed network of linear depressions located along specific sectors of the global ocean floor. Global trench distribution maps represent these features through continuous lines or segmented arcs positioned along ocean basin margins. These mapping frameworks treat trenches as geographic reference elements rather than individual structural formations. Cartographic representations typically place trenches along narrow boundary corridors, separating major oceanic regions. Most global maps display trench positions using standardized line symbols that follow the curvature of ocean basin edges. These symbols extend across large portions of the Pacific Basin and appear in smaller clusters in other ocean regions. The Pacific Ocean contains the highest concentration of mapped trench segments in global reference grids. These segments form long chains that trace the perimeter of the basin. Outside the Pacific region, trench distribution appears more limited and geographically separated. Mapping frameworks place several trenches along parts of the Indian Ocean boundary and near island arc systems. Additional trench features appear in smaller regional sectors such as the Caribbean and the Scotia region of the South Atlantic. These locations appear on global trench maps as isolated or shorter arc-shaped segments. Global reference grids often organize trench locations relative to major ocean basins. In these systems, trenches are plotted as boundary-aligned features, positioned near continental margins or adjacent island arc regions. Their mapped orientation frequently follows the outer edges of basin-scale oceanic areas. This arrangement produces a recognizable perimeter pattern across large portions of the Pacific Basin. Cartographic trench datasets also maintain consistent geographic coordinates. These coordinates allow trench lines to be reproduced across multiple oceanographic map systems. Forests. As a result, global trench distribution maps show a stable network of trench corridors that repeat across reference atlases, bathymetric charts, and global ocean floor mapping projects. The Pacific Ocean contains the largest continuous grouping of mapped ocean trenches in global trench distribution systems. On global reference maps, trench lines form an extended band that traces much of the outer margin of the Pacific Basin. This arrangement appears as a broad arc surrounding large sections of the basin's perimeter. The mapped pattern extends across both the western and eastern sides of the Pacific Ocean. In the western Pacific region, trench segments appear in long, closely spaced arcs aligned along island arc systems. Global mapping grids place multiple trench corridors along the margins of Japan, the Kuril region, the Mariana area, and parts of the Philippine Sea boundary. These trench lines often appear connected or nearly continuous when displayed at basin scale. Cartographic datasets represent them as repeating arcs that follow the outer edges of several island arc chains. Across the northern Pacific, trench mapping continues along a curved alignment stretching from the northwest Pacific toward the Aleutian region. Global trench maps show this alignment as part of the broader Pacific perimeter band. The corridor then continues along the northeastern Pacific margin, where additional trench segments appear adjacent to continental margins. Along the eastern Pacific basin, trench placement follows the outer margin of the Americas. In global mapping systems, these trenches appear as elongated lines positioned parallel to the continental edge of North and South America. The mapped trench corridor extends across thousands of kilometers along this boundary zone. When viewed together on global trench reference grids, these western, northern, and eastern trench segments form a nearly continuous geographic band around much of the Pacific basin. Cartographic datasets consistently reproduce this configuration across ocean floor atlases and global bathymetric mapping projects. If ocean, the Pacific Basin Trench Concentration Band therefore appears as the most extensive trench grouping in global ocean trench distribution maps. Ocean trench occurrence within the Atlantic Basin appears in a limited number of mapped sectors when compared with other ocean basins. Global trench distribution maps show only a few trench lines positioned along the margins of the Atlantic region. These mapped features appear as isolated arcs rather than long continuous corridors. Their placement occurs mainly in peripheral areas of the basin. One of the principal trench zones appears in the Caribbean region. In global ocean floor reference maps, the Puerto Rico Trench forms a prominent trench segment along the northern boundary of the Caribbean Sea. Cartographic datasets display this trench as a curved line positioned between the Greater Antilles Island Arc and the Western Atlantic Basin. The mapped alignment follows an east-west orientation across this regional boundary area. Another Atlantic trench zone appears in the South Atlantic sector near the Scotia region. Global trench maps place the South Sandwich Trench along the eastern side of the Scotia Sea. In basin-scale reference grids, this trench appears as a narrow arc extending in a north-south orientation near the South Sandwich Island Arc. The mapped corridor occupies a relatively small portion of the overall Atlantic Basin. When these Atlantic trench features are viewed within global trench distribution frameworks, they appear widely separated from each other. The Caribbean Trench Zone lies in the northern Atlantic sector, while the South Sandwich Trench Zone occupies a far southern position near subpolar waters. Large portions of the central Atlantic Basin display no trench lines in global mapping systems. As a result, global trench reference maps depict the Atlantic Basin as containing only a small number of trench occurrence zones. These zones appear at the margins of the basin rather than along its central areas. The mapped trench network within the Atlantic therefore consists of a few geographically separated segments rather than a continuous basin-scale band. Ocean trench placement within the Indian Ocean Basin appears in several distinct sectors distributed along the basin's eastern and northeastern margins. Global trench distribution maps show these features as curved or segmented lines, positioned near island arc systems and adjacent ocean margins. In basin-scale reference grids, the trenches of the Indian Ocean do not form a continuous perimeter band. Instead, they appear in separated regional corridors. One of the principal trench sectors occurs along the eastern boundary of the Indian Ocean near the Sunda region. In global ocean floor mapping frameworks, the Sunda Trench appears as an extended arc aligned parallel to the Indonesian island chain. Cartographic datasets represent this trench as a long, continuous line stretching along the southern margins of Sumatra and Java. The mapped corridor follows a generally northwest to southeastern orientation across this sector. Additional trench segments appear farther east in the transition zone between the eastern Indian Ocean and the western Pacific region. Global reference maps place several trench lines near island arc systems that connect the Indonesian archipelago with the western Pacific trench networks. These segments appear as shorter arcs positioned between island groups and adjacent ocean basins. Within the central Indian Ocean basin, trench lines are largely absent in global mapping systems. Basin-scale reference grids show wide areas of the central Indian Ocean without trench features. The mapped trench corridors remain concentrated near the basin's eastern boundary and surrounding island arc margins. When displayed within global trench distribution atlases, these Indian Ocean trench sectors appear as a limited set of arc-shaped segments positioned along the basin's outer edges. The arrangement contrasts with the extensive trench network surrounding the Pacific basin. In global cartographic frameworks, the Indian Ocean therefore contains a smaller number of trench placement sectors, distributed primarily along its eastern margin and adjoining island arc regions. Ocean trench reference areas in the Southern Ocean appeared primarily along the boundary zones that connect the southern margins of the Atlantic and Pacific basins. Global trench distribution maps display these features as arc-shaped segments positioned near island arc chains and adjacent ocean sectors. In basin-scale reference grids, the Southern Ocean contains fewer trench corridors than the Pacific Basin, and these corridors occupy relatively small geographic sectors. One of the principal trench reference areas occurs in the region surrounding the Scotia Sea. Global ocean floor mapping systems show the South Sandwich Trench as a prominent arc positioned along the eastern side of this region. Cartographic datasets depict the trench as a curved line extending in a north-south orientation near the South Sandwich Island arc. The mapped alignment occupies a narrow corridor between the Scotia Sea and the surrounding Southern Ocean waters. Additional trench segments appear in nearby sectors connected to the southern boundary of the Atlantic Basin. In global trench reference maps, these segments form short arcs positioned around the perimeter of the Scotia Plate region. The mapped trench lines appear closely associated with island arc chains and nearby ocean margin boundaries. These corridors occupy limited geographic areas compared with the extensive trench arcs of the Pacific Basin. Large portions of the wider Southern Ocean Basin display no mapped trench lines in global trench distribution frameworks. Basin-scale mapping grids show broad regions surrounding Antarctica where trench symbols are absent. Trench corridors therefore appear concentrated in a small number of localized sectors, rather than forming continuous bands. When global trench reference atlases display the Southern Ocean region, the trench network appears as a compact group of arc-shaped segments positioned near the Scotia Sea and the South Sandwich Island arc system. These mapped features represent the primary trench reference areas within the Southern Ocean portion of global trench distribution maps. Global trench distribution maps reveal clear differences in the spatial concentration of trenches among the major ocean basins. Cartographic reference systems display the Pacific Basin with the most extensive collection of mapped trench lines. These trenches form long arc-shaped corridors that follow large portions of the basin perimeter. Multiple trench segments appear connected or closely spaced in global ocean floor mapping grids. In contrast, the Atlantic Basin contains only a small number of mapped trench zones. Global trench reference maps show these features mainly in peripheral regions, such as the Caribbean sector and the South Sandwich region of the Southern Atlantic. The mapped trench segments in this basin appear separated by large distances. Central areas of the Atlantic Basin typically display no trench lines in global distribution atlases. The Indian Ocean Basin occupies an intermediate position in global trench distribution frameworks. Basin-scale maps display several trench corridors along the eastern boundary of the Indian Ocean, particularly near the Indonesian island arc system. These mapped features appear as elongated arcs positioned near island arc chains and adjoining ocean basin margins. Outside these eastern sectors, trench lines appear less frequently across the broader basin. Southern ocean mapping grids display a small number of trench corridors positioned near the Scotia Sea and the South Sandwich Island arc. These trench segments appear as localized arcs within the wider circumantarctic ocean region. Large portions of the surrounding ocean areas display no mapped trench features in global reference systems. When global ocean floor atlases present trench distribution across all basins, the resulting pattern shows strong geographic variation. The Pacific Basin contains the most continuous trench corridors. The Indian Ocean contains several regionally concentrated trench sectors. The Atlantic and Southern Ocean basins contain only a limited number of separated trench occurrence areas in comparison with the broader Pacific network. Western continental margin trench belts appear along several major continental edges where mapped trench corridors follow the outer boundary of continental landmasses. Global ocean floor mapping systems display these trench belts as elongated arcs positioned parallel to the western coastlines of continents. In basin-scale cartographic frameworks, the trench lines occupy narrow offshore corridors that trace the margin between continental shelves and adjacent ocean basins. One of the most prominent western continental margin trench belts appears along the Pacific coast of South America. Global trench distribution maps show the Peru-Chile Trench extending in a long north-south alignment parallel to the western edge of the continent. Cartographic datasets represent this trench as a continuous linear feature positioned offshore along the Pacific margin of Peru and Chile. The mapped corridor follows the outer boundary of the South American continental margin across a large latitudinal range. Another western continental margin trench belt occurs along the Pacific coast of North America, in the region extending towards Central America. In global mapping frameworks, trench lines appear near the continental margin, off Mexico and Central America. These mapped segments align roughly parallel to the coastline and occupy a narrow offshore corridor separating the continental margin from the adjacent ocean basin. Western continental margin trench belts also appear along parts of the western Pacific continental boundary near East Asia. In global trench reference maps, several trench corridors extend offshore from the eastern edge of the Asian continental margin. These mapped features follow curved alignments positioned between the continental coastline and nearby island arc systems. When displayed in global trench atlases, western continental margin trench belts appear as elongated boundary-aligned corridors that parallel continental coastlines. Their placement emphasizes the spatial relationship between trench lines and the outer edges of continental landmasses across multiple ocean basins. Eastern continental margin trench sectors appear in a smaller number of global ocean regions when compared with trench belts positioned along western continental margins. In global trench distribution maps, these sectors occur where trench corridors align with the eastern edges of continental landmasses. The mapped trench lines appear offshore and generally follow the curvature of continental coastlines. One example of an eastern continental margin trench sector appears in the Caribbean region along the northern margin of the Caribbean plate. Global mapping frameworks place the Puerto Rico Trench along the eastern continental boundary of the Caribbean Basin. Cartographic datasets display this trench as an elongated arc positioned offshore from the Greater Antilles Island chain. The trench line occupies a corridor that parallels the eastern margin of the Caribbean Island Arc region. Another eastern margin trench sector appears in the South Atlantic region near the eastern side of the South American continental boundary. In global trench reference maps, the South Sandwich Trench occupies an arc-shaped corridor positioned east of the southern Atlantic continental margin. The mapped alignment lies between the Scotia Sea region and the surrounding Atlantic basin. Additional eastern continental margin trench sectors occur near the transition zones between continental margins and nearby island arc systems. In global trench atlatis, these segments appear as shorter arcs positioned along the eastern boundaries of continental regions. The trench lines remain concentrated near offshore island arcs in adjacent ocean margins rather than extending along long continuous continental edges. When displayed in basin-scale mapping systems, eastern continental margin trench sectors appear as localized corridors positioned offshore from continental land masses. These trench segments form discrete arcs rather than extended belts. The placement highlights the spatial relationship between trench lines and the eastern boundaries of continental regions across selected ocean sectors. Island arc margin trench corridors appear in global trench distribution maps as elongated arcs positioned adjacent to chains of oceanic islands. These corridors follow the outer margins of island arc systems and occupy narrow offshore zones separating island arcs from adjacent ocean basins. In global mapping frameworks, trench lines trace the geographic alignment of these island chains across multiple ocean regions. Several prominent island arc margin trench corridors occur in the western Pacific Ocean. Global ocean floor atlases show trench segments extending along the margins of the Mariana Island Arc, the Izu-Bonin Island Arc, and the Kuril Island Arc. Cartographic datasets represent these trenches as curved lines positioned seaward of the island chains. The mapped corridors often follow the arc-shaped geometry of the island systems. Additional island arc trench corridors appear along the margins of the Philippine Island Arc region. In basin-scale reference grids, trench lines align along the eastern boundary of the Philippine Island chain. These mapped features form elongated arcs that trace the offshore edge of the island arc system and connect with nearby trench corridors in adjacent regions. Island arc trench corridors also occur along the South Sandwich Island Arc in the southern Atlantic sector. Global trench maps depict this corridor as a narrow arc extending along the eastern side of the island chain. The mapped trench line occupies a small regional corridor positioned between the island arc and surrounding ocean sectors. When displayed in global trench distribution atlases, island arc margin trench corridors appear as curved offshore alignments closely associated with island arc chains. These mapped trench lines follow the geographic configuration of island arcs across different ocean basins. Their placement emphasizes the recurring spatial relationship between trench corridors and island arc margin systems in global ocean floor mapping frameworks. Offshore continental edge trench zones appear in global ocean floor mapping systems as elongated depressions positioned beyond the outer limits of continental margins. These zones occur at distances offshore from continental coastlines and follow the outer boundary of continental edges, where ocean basins extend outward from land masses. Global trench distribution maps represent these features as narrow arc-shaped lines that trace the offshore contour of continental boundaries. Several offshore continental edge trench zones occur along the Pacific margin of the Americas. In basin-scale mapping grids, trench lines appear seaward of the continental edge and extend parallel to the continental coastline over long distances. Cartographic datasets display these trenches as continuous offshore corridors that remain separated from the continental shelf by a narrow oceanic zone. Offshore trench zones also appear near the continental margins of East Asia, Global trench atlases place several trench corridors beyond the eastern edge of the Asian continental boundary. These mapped features occupy offshore sectors that lie between the continental margin and nearby island arc systems. The trench lines follow curved alignments that mirror the regional configuration of the continental edge. Additional offshore continental edge trench zones occur near the southeastern margins of the Eurasian continental region and along adjacent ocean basins. In global mapping frameworks, these trenches appear as shorter arcs, positioned along offshore sectors where continental edges transition into surrounding oceanic areas. The mapped corridors remain aligned with the shades of paint, and baselines remain based. Across global trench distribution atlases, offshore continental edge trench zones appear as boundary-aligned corridors that trace the outer limits of continental margins. Their placement highlights the spatial separation between continental coastlines and trench lines in offshore ocean sectors. The mapped pattern shows trench corridors occupying narrow zones along the outer edge of continental landmasses across multiple ocean regions. Continental corner trench intersections appear in global trench distribution maps, where two continental margins meet and trench corridors change directional alignment. These locations occur near the angular boundaries of continental landmasses, where ocean basin edges shift orientation. In global ocean floor reference grids, trench lines at these sites display curved or segmented geometries that correspond with the turning points of continental outlines. One example appears near the southern boundary of the South American continent. Global mapping systems display the Peru-Chile trench extending along the western continental margin before shifting orientation near the southern tip of the continent. In basin-scale atlases, the trench alignment transitions toward the Scotia region, forming a junction between continental margin trench corridors and nearby island arc trench systems. Another continental corner trench intersection occurs near the northern boundary of the Pacific Basin, adjacent to the Alaskan continental margin. In global trench maps, the trench corridor, extending along the western coast of North America, changes direction near the Alaska region and continues toward the Aleutian Island Arc sector. The mapped trench line follows a curved path that reflects the angular transition of the continental boundary. Additional corner trench intersections appear near the southeastern boundary of the Asian continental margin, where continental edges transition into island arc regions of the Western Pacific. In global ocean floor atlases, trench lines curve around the edges of continental landmasses and connect with adjacent trench corridors positioned along nearby island arc margins. Across global trench reference maps, continental corner trench intersections appear as nodal points where trench corridors alter orientation along continental outlines. These intersections highlight areas where trench lines follow the geometric transitions of continental margins. The mapped pattern emphasizes the spatial relationship between trench corridors and the angular boundaries of major continental landmasses. Marginal basin trench adjacency regions appear in global ocean floor mapping systems, where trench corridors lie next to marginal seas or semi-enclosed ocean basins. These areas occur along the outer edges of marginal basins that are separated from larger ocean basins by island arcs or continental boundaries. In global trench distribution maps, trench lines occupy narrow corridors positioned along the basin-facing side of these marginal seas. Several prominent adjacency regions occur in the Western Pacific, where numerous marginal basins are present. Global mapping frameworks show trench corridors positioned alongside the Philippine Sea, the Sea of Japan region, and nearby marginal basins. In these areas, trench lines appear as elongated arcs that follow the outer margins of island arc systems, separating the marginal basins from the broader Pacific Basin. Cartographic datasets display these trenches as continuous or segmented lines, tracing the seaward edge of the basin boundaries. Additional marginal basin trench adjacency regions occur near the Indonesian archipelago. Global ocean floor atlases place trench corridors along the outer margins of basins, such as the Banda Sea and surrounding marginal seas. The mapped trench alignments appeared parallel to the island arc systems that define the boundaries of these enclosed or semi-enclosed basins. In the Caribbean region, trench adjacency also appears near marginal basin environments surrounding the Caribbean Sea. Global trench distribution maps display the Puerto Rico Trench along the northern boundary of the basin. The trench corridor occupies a narrow offshore zone adjacent to the marginal sea region and aligned with the outer edge of the basin boundary. Across global trench reference maps, marginal basin trench adjacency regions appear as trench corridors positioned alongside enclosed or partially enclosed ocean basins. These mapped features emphasize the spatial proximity between trench lines and the boundaries of marginal seas in several major ocean regions. The Western Pacific Trench Cluster System represents the most concentrated regional grouping of ocean trenches in global distribution maps. 1. In basin-scale reference grids, numerous trench corridors appear along the western boundary of the Pacific Ocean. These trenches occur in close geographic proximity and form a continuous sequence of arc-shaped segments extending across a wide latitudinal range. Global ocean floor atlases show several major trench corridors positioned within this regional cluster. The Kuril-Kamchatka Trench, the Japan Trench, the Izu-Bonin Trench, and the Mariana Trench appear as successive arcs aligned along the western margin of the Pacific Basin. Cartographic datasets represent these features as elongated lines positioned offshore from island arc chains. The mapped corridors often follow similar directional orientations and lie within relatively short distances of one another. Additional trench segments occur farther south within the same regional cluster. Global trench reference maps display trench lines near the Philippine Island arc region and adjacent island groups of the Western Pacific. These mapped features form additional arc-shaped segments that continue the chain of trench corridors extending across the Western Basin boundary. Within global trench distribution frameworks, the Western Pacific cluster appears as a dense network of adjacent trench arcs rather than isolated individual features. Mapping systems display these trenches as closely spaced corridors aligned along successive island arc systems. The repeated arc-shaped geometry of the trench lines produces a recognizable pattern across this sector of the Pacific Basin. When viewed in global ocean floor atlases, the Western Pacific Trench Cluster System occupies a long belt along the basin's western perimeter. The grouping includes multiple trench corridors positioned near island arcs and adjacent offshore regions. This regional arrangement forms one of the most prominent trench cluster patterns visible in global trench distribution maps. The Eastern Pacific Trench Cluster System forms a continuous grouping of trench corridors along the eastern boundary of the Pacific Ocean. In global trench distribution maps, these trenches appear as elongated arcs, positioned parallel to the continental margins of North and South America. The mapped corridors occupy a narrow band between the continental edge and the wider Pacific Basin. Several major trench segments appear within this regional cluster. Global ocean floor atlases display the Middle America Trench extending along the offshore margins of Mexico and Central America. Cartographic datasets represent this trench as a long arc-shaped line that follows the coastal orientation of the continental margin. The mapped corridor extends across a broad latitudinal range within the Eastern Pacific sector. Farther south, the Peru-Chile Trench forms another major component of the Eastern Pacific Trench Cluster. In basin-scale reference maps, this trench appears as a long linear arc, aligned parallel to the western edge of the South American continent. The trench corridor extends across a large portion of the Eastern Pacific boundary and maintains a consistent offshore alignment relative to the continental coastline. When displayed together in global mapping systems, the Middle America Trench and the Peru-Chile Trench form a continuous chain of trench segments along the Eastern Pacific Basin margin. These corridors appear connected through adjacent arc-shaped alignments that trace the length of the continental boundary. Within global trench distribution frameworks, the Eastern Pacific Cluster appears as a linear system positioned along the outer edge of the American continents. A grouping forms a long north-south arrangement of trench corridors extending from the northeastern Pacific region toward the southern Pacific sector. This regional cluster represents one of the primary trench groupings identified in global ocean floor mapping atlases. The Southwest Pacific Trench Grouping forms a regional cluster of trench corridors located across the southwestern sector of the Pacific Ocean. A couple of miles back between half the cell and chest was seen to be terrified. In global trench distribution maps, this grouping appears as a series of curved trench segments extending through the island regions northeast of Australia and east of the Indonesian archipelago. These trenches occupy a broad regional belt positioned between the Western Pacific Trench systems and the Central Pacific Basin. Several trench corridors are represented within this regional grouping. Global ocean floor atlases display the New Britain Trench and the New Hebrides Trench as major components of the Southwest Pacific Cluster. Cartographic datasets represent these features as elongated arc-shaped lines located along the outer edges of island arc chains in the region. The mapped trench corridors extend across ocean sectors surrounding Papua New Guinea and the island chains of Vanuatu. Additional trench segments appear farther south in the vicinity of the Tonga and Kermadec island arcs. In global mapping frameworks, these trenches form long arc-shaped alignments positioned east of the island chains. The mapped corridors extend across a large portion of the Southwest Pacific region and connect visually with other trench segments positioned along adjacent island arcs. When displayed together in basin-scale reference maps, these trench corridors create a continuous grouping that spans multiple island arc systems. The trench lines appear arranged in parallel or slightly curved alignments that follow the regional configuration of island chains across the Southwest Pacific. Within global trench distribution atlases, the Southwest Pacific Trench Grouping occupies a wide geographic zone extending across the southwestern quadrant of the Pacific Basin. The cluster includes several major trench corridors positioned along island arc margins and adjacent offshore regions. This grouping forms one of the prominent regional trench clusters identified in global ocean floor mapping systems. The Northern Pacific Trench Cluster occupies a broad arc across the upper sector of the Pacific Ocean Basin. In global trench distribution maps, this cluster appears as a sequence of trench corridors positioned along the northern boundary of the Pacific Basin. The mapped trenches extend across the ocean region between the northwestern Asian margin and the northwestern margin of North America. Several major trench corridors form the central components of this regional grouping. Global ocean floor atlases display the Kuril, Kamchatka Trench, and the Japan Trench as prominent arcs located along the northwestern Pacific margin. Cartographic datasets represent these trenches as elongated curved lines positioned offshore from the island arcs of northeastern Asia. The mapped corridors follow the general orientation of the regional island arc systems. Farther east, the Aleutian Trench forms another major segment of the Northern Pacific Trench Cluster. In basin-scale mapping frameworks, this trench appears as a long arc extending along the southern margin of the Aleutian Island chain. The mapped trench corridor stretches across the northern Pacific in a broad east-west alignment that parallels the arc-shaped configuration of the islands. When viewed together in global trench distribution atlases, these trench corridors form a continuous arc across the northern sector of the Pacific Basin. The Kuril, Kamchatka, Japan, and Aleutian trench segments appear as closely spaced arcs arranged along the perimeter of the basin. Their placement produces a recognizable northern boundary band in global ocean floor mapping systems. Within global trench distribution frameworks, the Northern Pacific Trench Cluster appears as a large regional grouping extending across the upper margin of the Pacific Basin. The mapped trench corridors remain closely associated with island arc chains that span the Northern Pacific region. The Indian Ocean Trench Grouping forms a regional cluster of trench corridors concentrated along the eastern boundary of the Indian Ocean Basin. In global trench distribution maps, these trenches appear as elongated arcs positioned near the Indonesian archipelago and adjacent island arc systems. The mapped corridors occupy a regional belt that links the eastern Indian Ocean with the western Pacific trench networks. One of the principal trench corridors within this grouping is the Sunda Trench. Global ocean floor atlases represent this trench as a long arc extending along the southern margin of the Indonesian island chain. The mapped corridor follows a generally northwest-southeast alignment that parallels the outer edge of Sumatra and Java. In basin-scale reference maps, the trench forms the most continuous trench segment within the Indian Ocean region. Additional trench segments appear near island arc systems located east of the main Sunda corridor. Global trench distribution datasets display trench lines in the vicinity of the Banda region and neighboring island groups. These segments appear as shorter arc-shaped alignments, positioned between the eastern Indian Ocean basin and adjoining western Pacific sectors. When displayed together in global mapping systems, these trench corridors create a regional grouping that traces the outer boundary of the Indonesian island arc complex. The mapped trenches form a chain of adjacent arcs that extend across multiple island groups within the eastern Indian Ocean sector. Within global trench distribution frameworks, the Indian Ocean trench grouping appears more geographically concentrated than the large trench clusters of the Pacific Basin. The mapped trench corridors occupy a limited portion of the basin, with most segments positioned near the Indonesian island arc region. This arrangement forms the primary regional trench cluster, identified within the Indian Ocean sector of global ocean floor maps. The Caribbean Trench Regional Cluster forms a localized grouping of trench corridors in the northern sector of the Atlantic Ocean basin. In global trench distribution maps, this cluster appears as a narrow arc-shaped alignment positioned along the northern boundary of the Caribbean Sea. The mapped trench corridors occur near island chains that separate the Caribbean basin from the open Atlantic Ocean. The Puerto Rico Trench represents the primary trench corridor within this regional grouping. Global ocean floor atlases display this trench as an elongated arc extending along the northern edge of the Caribbean region. Cartographic datasets depict the trench line running roughly east-west across the boundary between the Caribbean Sea and the western Atlantic Basin. The mapped corridor lies offshore from the Greater Antilles island chain. Additional trench segments appear in nearby sectors east of the main Puerto Rico corridor. In global mapping frameworks, shorter trench lines extend toward the region surrounding the Lesser Antilles island arc. These mapped segments appear as curved arcs that continue the alignment of the main Caribbean trench corridor across the northeastern edge of the Caribbean basin. When displayed together in basin-scale reference maps, these trench segments create a compact regional grouping, positioned along the northern boundary of the Caribbean Sea. The mapped trenches remain confined to a relatively small geographic area compared with the larger trench clusters of the Pacific Ocean. Within global trench distribution frameworks, the Caribbean Trench Regional Cluster appears as a distinct trench grouping within the Atlantic sector. The mapped corridors occupy a limited zone adjacent to the island arc systems that border the Caribbean basin. This arrangement forms the principal trench cluster represented within the Caribbean region of global ocean floor maps. The Western Pacific Trench Corridor chain appears in global ocean floor mapping systems as one of the longest continuous alignments of trench segments. In basin-scale trench distribution maps, these corridors extend along the western boundary of the Pacific Ocean. The mapped trench lines form a sequence of connected arcs positioned near major island arc systems. Several trench corridors appear consecutively along this Western Pacific chain. Global trench reference atlases display the Kuril-Kamchatka Trench, the Japan Trench, the Izu-Bonan Trench, and the Mariana Trench, arranged along a broad north-south corridor. Cartographic datasets represent these trenches as elongated arcs that trace the outer edges of island arc chains located offshore from the Asian continental margin. In mapping frameworks that emphasize corridor-style alignment, these trench segments appear positioned along a nearly continuous geographic path. The mapped trench lines follow the general curvature of the Western Pacific Basin margin. Individual trench corridors appear adjacent to one another, forming a chain that extends across a large portion of the basin's western boundary. Farther south, the corridor chain continues through additional trench segments near the Philippine Island Arc region. Global ocean floor atlases show these trenches extending the corridor alignment toward the equatorial Western Pacific. The mapped segments maintain a similar arc-shaped geometry and remain positioned along the outer margins of island arc systems. When displayed together in global trench distribution maps, the Western Pacific Trench Corridor chain forms a prominent linear system. The trench lines create a recognizable sequence of connected arcs, extending across thousands of kilometers along the Western Pacific Basin edge. This corridor-style alignment represents one of the most extensive trench chains visible in global ocean floor, and the incident apologized to power above them. The Eastern Pacific Margin Trench Corridor forms a long linear alignment positioned along the outer boundary of the American continental margin. In global trench distribution maps, this corridor appears as a continuous sequence of trench segments extending along the eastern edge of the Pacific Ocean basin. The mapped trench lines remain parallel to the western coastline of North and South America across a large latitudinal range. Within global ocean floor atlases, two major trench corridors form the primary components of this Eastern Pacific alignment. The Middle America Trench appears along the offshore margins of Mexico and Central America. Cartographic datasets represent this trench as a curved line that follows the orientation of the continental margin across the northeastern Pacific sector. Farther south, the Peru-Chile Trench continues the corridor alignment along the western edge of the South American continent. Global trench reference maps depict this trench as a long arc extending across much of the eastern Pacific Basin boundary. The mapped corridor maintains a consistent offshore position relative to the continental coastline and follows the north-south orientation of the continental margin. When displayed together in basin-scale mapping systems, these trench segments form a nearly continuous corridor extending from the northeastern Pacific toward the southern Pacific region. The trench lines appear connected through adjacent arc-shaped alignments that trace the outer boundary of the American continental margin. In global trench distribution frameworks, the Eastern Pacific Margin Trench Corridor appears as one of the most prominent linear trench systems outside the Western Pacific region. The mapped trench alignment extends along the full length of the continental margin, forming a major corridor-style geographic pattern in global ocean floor mapping atlases. The Indonesian Trench Corridor system appears in global trench distribution maps as a linear alignment extending across the eastern margin of the Indian Ocean and the adjoining Western Pacific sector. In basin-scale mapping frameworks, trench lines trace the outer boundary of the Indonesian island chain and form a corridor that connects several regional trench segments. The mapped alignment extends across a complex arrangement of island groups that separate the Indian Ocean from the Western Pacific Basin. One of the principal components of this corridor system is the Sunda Trench. Global ocean floor atlases represent this trench as a long arc positioned along the southern margins of Sumatra and Java. Cartographic datasets depict the trench line following a northwest-southeastern orientation that parallels the outer edge of the Indian-Asian archipelago. The mapped corridor occupies a narrow offshore zone between the island chain and the adjacent Indian Ocean basin. Farther east, additional trench segments appear near the Banda Sea region and surrounding island arcs. In global trench reference maps, these segments form curved alignments positioned along the outer boundaries of several island arc systems. The mapped trench lines extend through multiple island groups that lie between the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. When displayed together in global ocean floor mapping systems, these trench segments create a corridor-style chain that links several regional trench arcs across the Indonesian archipelago. The mapped trenches appear arranged in successive arc-shaped alignments that follow the geographic configuration of the island chain. Within global trench distribution atlases, the Indonesian Trench Corridor system forms a transitional trench alignment between the Indian Ocean Trench grouping and the Western Pacific Trench networks. The corridor extends across a wide island arc region and represents a prominent linear trench system in global ocean floor mapping frameworks. The Aleutian Trench Corridor arc appears in global trench distribution maps as a long curved alignment across the northern sector of the Pacific Ocean basin. In basin-scale mapping frameworks, this corridor extends along the southern margin of the Aleutian island chain. The mapped trench line forms a broad arc separating the northern Pacific basin from the island arc system that stretches between Alaska and the western Pacific region. Global ocean floor atlases display the Aleutian Trench as a continuous arc extending from the Kamchatka region in the west toward the Gulf of Alaska in the east. Cartographic datasets represent the trench corridor as a curved line that mirrors the configuration of the Aleutian island chain. The mapped alignment follows a generally east-west orientation across the northern Pacific sector. Within global trench reference grids, the Aleutian Trench Corridor connects with adjacent trench systems positioned along the northwestern Pacific Basin margin. The trench arc approaches the Kuril, Kamchatka Trench Corridor near the western end of the Aleutian island chain. In mapping frameworks that emphasize corridor-style alignments, these trench segments appear as part of a larger chain extending across the northern Pacific. Along the eastern portion of the corridor, the trench alignment curves toward the North American continental margin. Global trench maps depict the arc bending gradually along the southern edge of Alaska before approaching the continental boundary. The trench corridor maintains a consistent offshore position relative to the island arc chain throughout this region. In global trench distribution atlases, the Aleutian Trench Corridor arc forms a prominent curved trench alignment across the northern Pacific Basin. The mapped trench corridor follows the geographic arc of the Aleutian island chain and represents a major component of the northern Pacific Trench Corridor system. The South American Margin Trench Corridor appears in global trench distribution maps as a long linear alignment positioned along the western boundary of the South American continent. In basin-scale mapping frameworks, this corridor extends along the outer margin of the Pacific Ocean basin and follows the length of the continental coastline. The mapped trench line occupies a narrow offshore band that parallels the continental margin across a large north-south distance. Global ocean floor atlases display the Peru-Chile Trench as the principal corridor within this alignment. Cartographic datasets represent the trench as an elongated arc that traces the offshore boundary of South America from the equatorial Pacific sector toward the southern part of the continent. The mapped corridor maintains a consistent orientation relative to the continental coastline and appears as a continuous trench segment in basin-scale reference grids. Across much of its length, the trench corridor remains positioned a short distance offshore from the continental edge. Global trench maps depict the corridor as a narrow line, separating the continental margin from the wider Pacific basin. The alignment follows the general north-south orientation of the South American coastline and remains parallel to the continental boundary. Near the northern portion of the corridor, the trench alignment approaches the region where the Middle America Trench System occupies the eastern Pacific margin farther north. In global mapping systems, the two trench corridors appear as adjacent segments positioned along the same basin boundary. In global trench distribution atlases, the South American Margin Trench Corridor forms one of the most prominent linear trench systems associated with the continental margin. The mapped trench alignment traces the full western edge of the South American continent and represents a major corridor-style feature within global ocean floor mapping frameworks. The Southwest Pacific Trench Corridor appears in global trench distribution maps as a broad alignment of trench segments extending across the southwestern sector of the Pacific Ocean basin. In basin-scale mapping frameworks, the corridor traces a sequence of trench arcs positioned east of Australia and north of New Zealand. The mapped trench lines occupy a regional belt that follows the outer margins of island arc chains in this part of the Pacific. Several trench segments form the main components of this corridor system. Global ocean floor atlases display the New Britain Trench and the New Hebrides Trench as major arcs within the Southwest Pacific sector. Cartographic datasets represent these trenches as curved alignments, positioned along the seaward edges of island arc chains near Papua New Guinea and the islands of Vanuatu. The mapped corridors extend across multiple island groups and form successive arc-shaped subregions being redistinguished. Farther south, the Tonga Trench and the Kermadec Trench continue the corridor alignment toward the region northeast. In global trench reference maps, these trenches appear as elongated arcs positioned along the eastern margins of the Tonga and Kermadec island chains. The mapped trench lines follow a north-south orientation across the southwestern Pacific basin. When displayed together in global ocean floor mapping systems, these trench segments create a long corridor-style alignment across the Southwest Pacific region. The trench arcs appear connected through adjacent segments that trace the regional configuration of island arc systems. In global trench distribution atlases, the Southwest Pacific Trench Corridor forms one of the most extensive trench alignments outside the main Western Pacific Trench chain. The mapped trench system spans a wide geographic zone across the southwestern Pacific Basin and represents a major corridor-style trench network in global ocean floor maps. Southern Ocean Trench reference sectors appear in global trench distribution maps as a limited set of trench corridors located near the high-latitude ocean region surrounding Antarctica. In basin-scale ocean floor atlases, these trenches occur primarily in sectors where the Southern Ocean connects with the southern boundaries of the Atlantic and Pacific basins. The mapped trench segments appear as isolated arcs rather than continuous corridor systems. One of the principal trench reference sectors occurs near the Scotia Sea region. Global trench distribution frameworks display the South Sandwich Trench as the most prominent trench corridor within the Southern Ocean. Cartographic datasets represent this trench as a curved arc extending along the eastern side of the South Sandwich Island chain. The mapped trench line occupies a narrow corridor positioned between the island arc and the surrounding Southern Ocean basin. In global ocean floor mapping systems, this trench sector appears located between the Southern Atlantic Ocean and the wider Circum-Antarctic Ocean region. The mapped corridor forms a north-south arc that follows the alignment of the South Sandwich Island arc system. The trench segment occupies a relatively small geographic sector compared with the extensive trench systems of the Pacific Basin. Additional trench reference areas appear in nearby sectors of the Scotia Sea region. In basin-scale mapping grids, smaller trench segments extend along adjacent island arc boundaries surrounding the Scotia Plate region. These mapped features appear as short arc-shaped alignments positioned along the outer margins of island arc chains. Across global trench distribution atlases, Southern Ocean trench reference sectors appear as localized trench corridors positioned near high-latitude island arc systems. The mapped trenches remain concentrated in a small number of sectors rather than distributed widely across the Circum-Antarctic Ocean basin. Antarctic margin trench zones appear in global trench distribution maps as localized trench corridors positioned near the outer boundaries of the Antarctic Ocean region. In basin-scale mapping frameworks, these trenches occur along selected sectors where the Southern Ocean intersects with nearby island arc systems and adjacent ocean basins. The mapped trench lines appear as curved arcs situated within the high-latitude ocean belt surrounding the Antarctic continent. Global ocean floor atlases display the most prominent trench corridor in this region along the South Sandwich Island arc. Cartographic datasets represent the South Sandwich Trench as a narrow arc extending along the eastern margin of the island chain. The trench corridor occupies a sector positioned between the Scotia Sea and the surrounding Southern Ocean waters. The mapped alignment follows a north-south orientation relative to the island arc system. In global trench reference grids, this trench corridor appears near the outer boundary of the Antarctic Ocean region, rather than directly adjacent to the continental coastline of Antarctica. The mapped trench line remains separated from the Antarctic continental margin by a broad expanse of Southern Ocean waters. This arrangement distinguishes the trench corridor from continental margin trench belts located near lower latitude continents. Additional Antarctic margin trench zones appear in nearby sectors surrounding the Scotia region. In basin-scale mapping systems, shorter trench segments extend along adjacent island arc alignments that border the high-latitude ocean sector. These segments appear as small arc-shaped corridors positioned within the wider Circum-Antarctic Ocean region. Across global trench distribution atlases, Antarctic margin trench zones appear limited in number and restricted to specific high-latitude sectors. The mapped trench corridors remain concentrated near island arc systems, positioned along the outer margins of the Southern Ocean, rather than forming continuous trench systems around the Antarctic continent. South Atlantic peripheral trench regions appear in global trench distribution maps as isolated trench corridors positioned along the outer boundaries of the South Atlantic Basin. In basin-scale mapping frameworks, these trenches occur near the southern edge of the Atlantic Ocean, where the basin approaches the Southern Ocean sector. The mapped trench lines appear as narrow arc-shaped segments located at considerable distances from the central Atlantic Basin. The most prominent trench corridor in this region appears near the South Sandwich Island arc. Global ocean floor atlases display the South Sandwich Trench as a curved arc extending along the eastern margin of the island chain. Cartographic datasets represent this trench as a north-south oriented corridor positioned between the Scotia Sea and the surrounding South Atlantic waters. The mapped trench line occupies a peripheral location relative to the broader Atlantic basin. Within global trench reference grids, this trench corridor lies near the boundary between the South Atlantic and the circumantarctic ocean region. The mapped alignment follows the geographic arc of the South Centric Island chain and forms a narrow trench corridor along the edge of the regional ocean sector. Additional peripheral trench segments appear in nearby areas surrounding the Scotia region. In global trench distribution frameworks, these segments occur as short arcs located along the margins of island arc systems that border the Southern Atlantic sector. The mapped trenches remain confined to a limited geographic zone near the boundary of the basin. Across global ocean floor mapping atlases, South Atlantic peripheral trench regions appear as localized trench corridors positioned along the outer edge of the Atlantic basin. The mapped trench features remain separated from the central Atlantic Ocean floor and occur primarily near island arc systems located along the basin's southern boundary. Arctic-adjacent trench reference areas appear in global trench distribution maps near the northern limits of the Pacific Ocean basin, where the ocean approaches the Arctic region. In basin-scale mapping frameworks, trench corridors do not occur within the central Arctic Ocean basin. Instead, mapped trench lines appear in nearby ocean sectors that lie adjacent to the Arctic boundary of the Pacific basin. One of the principal trench reference areas appears along the northern Pacific region near the Aleutian Island arc. Global ocean floor atlases display the Aleutian Trench as a curved alignment extending along the southern margin of the Aleutian Island chain. Cartographic datasets represent this trench as a broad arc positioned between the northern Pacific basin and the island arc system that forms part of the ocean boundary near Alaska. Within global trench reference grids, the Aleutian Trench corridor appears in close proximity to the ocean gateway connecting the Pacific Ocean with the Arctic region through the Bering Strait. The mapped trench line follows an arc-shaped path along the outer margin of the island chain that separates the Pacific Basin from the Bering Sea sector. Additional trench segments appear in nearby sectors of the northern Pacific region along the Kuril-Kamchatka Trench corridor. In Global Trench Distribution Atlas, this trench forms another arc-shaped alignment extending along the island arc systems located west of the Aleutian chain. The mapped corridor lies within the high-latitude Pacific sector, adjacent to the Arctic boundary of the ocean basin. Across global ocean floor mapping frameworks, Arctic-adjacent trench reference areas appear limited to trench corridors positioned within the northern Pacific region. These mapped features occur near island arc systems that border the ocean sectors closest to the Arctic Ocean, rather than appearing within the Arctic basin itself. Subpolar Pacific trench placement sectors appear in global trench distribution maps across the high-latitude region of the Pacific Ocean, located south of the Arctic boundary. In basin-scale mapping frameworks, trench corridors occupy a wide arc that extends across the northern Pacific sector. These mapped trenches appear as curved alignments, positioned near island arc systems that form the outer margins of the basin. One of the principal trench placement sectors occurs along the Kuril-Kamchatka Island arc region. Global ocean floor atlases display the Kuril-Kamchatka Trench as a long arc extending along the offshore boundary of the island chain, located between northeastern Asia and the northwestern Pacific basin. Cartographic datasets represent this trench corridor as a curved line following the regional orientation of the island arc system. Additional trench placement sectors appear farther east along the Aleutian Island arc system. The mapped trench corridor traces the southern edge of the Aleutian Island chain and occupies a broad sector within the subpolar Pacific region. These trench corridors appear closely spaced when displayed together in basin-scale mapping systems. The mapped trench lines follow the arc-shaped configuration of island chains that extend across the northern Pacific region. Their placement forms a sequence of connected trench segments that trace the high-latitude margin of the Pacific Basin. Across global trench distribution atlases, subpolar Pacific trench placement sectors appear as a continuous band of trench corridors across the northern Pacific Ocean. The mapped trenches remain associated with island arc chains positioned within the subpolar region and represent a major high-latitude trench alignment within global ocean floor mapping frameworks. Remote ocean trench occurrence regions appear in global trench distribution maps as isolated trench corridors positioned far from continental coastlines. In basin-scale mapping frameworks, these trenches occur near island arc systems or plate boundary sectors located in the open ocean. The mapped trench lines occupy limited geographic zones within otherwise broad ocean basin areas. One example of a remote trench occurrence region appears in the central western Pacific near the Mariana Island arc. Global ocean floor atlases display the Mariana Trench as a curved trench corridor positioned far from the nearest continental landmass. Cartographic datasets represent the trench as an elongated arc aligned along the eastern margin of the Mariana Island chain. The mapped corridor occupies a remote sector of the Pacific Basin, surrounded by extensive open ocean. Additional remote trench occurrence regions appear in the southwest Pacific near island arc systems, such as Tonga and Kermadec. In global trench reference maps, the Tonga Trench and Kermadec Trench form arc-shaped corridors located far from continental boundaries. These mapped trenches extend across remote ocean sectors east of the island chains that define the regional trench alignment. Remote trench corridors also occur near island arcs, positioned in the eastern Indian Ocean sector. Global trench distribution atlases display trench segments near the Banda region and adjacent island arcs located between major ocean basins. These trenches appear as isolated arcs positioned within large open water regions. Across global ocean floor mapping frameworks, remote ocean trench occurrence regions appear as localized trench corridors situated within wide ocean basins. The mapped trenches remain associated with island arc chains rather than continental margins. Their distribution highlights trench occurrence in remote sectors of the global ocean, where large distances separate trench corridors from continental land masses. Across the global ocean floor, ocean trenches appear in many different regions. Some align along continental margins, while others trace the edges at island arc systems that extend across wide ocean sectors. A smaller number occur in distant areas of the oceans, where only a few trench corridors appear on global maps. When these locations are viewed together, the individual trench lines begin to form a larger geographic structure across the planet. Arc-shaped segments connect along basin margins. Corridor systems extend across island arc regions, and isolated trench zones appear along the outer boundaries of several ocean basins. On large-scale maps of the seafloor, these patterns spread across the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the high-latitude waters near the polar oceans. And across the world's oceans, these trench patterns continue to appear wherever the deep ocean floor is mapped at a global scale.